how you start your arguments, but how you finish them and actually prove the thing that you have claimed that you're going to be proving within a debate. I'm doing this because, having judged for quite a lot over the past few years, like hearing lots of assertions coming out in debates which are matched by equal assertions as opposed to rebuttal or better analysis makes judging quite difficult. So that's why I'm going to be talking about how you can tell whether or not you've proved the thing that you claim that you're going to be proving. So what I'm going to talk about first is how I like to see debate speeches. This comes with a disclaimer. This is not always how I present my debate speeches. If I'm in a bit of a panic, it's not also like how I always plan my debate speeches. And sometimes, because of the person that I'm prepping with, it's not always how I can sort of get to plan these, my speeches. So the sort of format I'm going to teach you is not like a rigorous one that you should try and stick to. The thing that I use it for is sort of a perspective on debate, something that's quite helpful. And essentially the way that I see the way that I see debates and debate speeches is a bit like proving mathematical formula or scientific claims. So you start off with a research question, which is developed from the motion that you get set. You then move on to the hypotheses which you believe are necessary and sufficient in order to prove the research question that you've set out for yourself. And you can prove these hypotheses with a specific set of axioms that you set out, which are true claims that you make within this debate. Then you infer everything from those claims in order to prove your hypotheses. So I'm going to talk about those three things. We're going to play a little game, and then we're going to look at assertions and re-characterizations, which should hopefully fit nicely in with what Adam was talking about, particularly talking at lower half of the table kind of speeches and how you're going to frame things. Okay? Everyone knows what all of those words mean. Great. Okay, so research questions. So you get set a motion, like this house would do X, or this house believes X is true. You can formulate that into a research question, which you determine like based on why you think that motion has been set. So this house would do X could be, is doing X a good thing? So yes if you're on proposition, no if you're on opposition, or is doing X necessary is quite a nice way to think about it. So this house would ban private schools. Is the act of banning private schools something necessary that will have a positive benefit on the education system within the United Kingdom? It's quite a good place to start. That's the thing that you are going to try and prove within this debate. And the important thing to note on this is the actual verb is really important. So the act of banning is the thing that you're trying to prove is necessary. You're not having a debate about whether or not private schools are a positive or negative impact on society. You're trying to work out whether or not the government has the right to ban them and whether or not that specific act is going to cause more positives than it is negatives. Okay, so the words that are in the motion, we have spent an agonising amount of time deliberating. I remember spending about 3 hours with Andrew Ford writing a motion for York IV. Like, all of those have been specifically selected, so it's important to take into consideration all of them when you're working out exactly what it is you think that you have to prove. If it's this house believes, then like standard, like, okay, this statement is true. X is a true thing, or rather, is X a true thing, to turn that into a question. Does that make sense? Yep, cool. Okay, so in terms of the hypotheses, these are sort of statements that you need to determine are going to allow you to prove X. So when you put all of these statements together, that means that you have proved the correct answer to your research question. So a way of thinking about this would be, okay, so suppose my research question is true, suppose it is true that private schools are a negative impact on society, like, what kind of follows from that? If that was the case, how would they be a negative impact? Well, they probably perpetuate the class system. So if I can prove that they perpetuate the class system, that shows a negative impact. They probably make it harder for people who don't go to private school to get into university. Well, that's a harm. If I can prove that that's true, then I can show that they are a negative thing. And all of these kind of work up to making a case as to why it would be necessary to ban them. So a little example. So in the debate, this house would ban gambling. If you're on proposition, your research question should be, will banning gambling solve the problem that I have identified that exists within society? Because gambling exists. In order to prove this, I'm going to show you that gambling is harmful, because if there's no harm, then I don't have to do a thing. I have to show that gambling cannot be regulated to protect people, because that could be what opposition says. They could just say, well, we could regulate it better, we could only let like some people do it. I could argue that banning gambling is going to reduce gambling. That's a theory that I have. I don't think theory is the right word there, but that's sort of my prediction for what's going to happen if I implement this policy. Or banning gambling is not going to lead to other harms, because if the act of banning gambling increases harms in other areas, then maybe it's not the best thing to take, because we still get a net negative from this thing that we're trying to do on proposition. So what I'm trying to do is find all of the things that I think are necessary and sufficient. And those two words are extremely important, right? If you do not choose all the things that are necessary, then you're leaving lots of arguments open for closing to come in and beat you. And if you say lots of things which go beyond what is sufficient to say, then you're wasting loads of time on irrelevant analysis, which means that you can't say all the things that you need to say in top half in order to beat bottom half. So the two words that you have to remember are necessary and sufficient. They're sort of the most important thing. The next bit, what we're going to talk about for the majority of the talk, is axioms, which is like what things are considered to be true within debates and what aren't. So is everyone following up till this point? We know what research question is, we know what hypotheses is. I'm not just saying random words at you. You're kind of following with my analogy. I realise that you're all humanities students, so this might be a little bit tough, but we've got it? Yep, okay. I'll take the sort of embarrassed smiles as a yes. Right, axioms. So in order to prove each statement, which kind of translates as to what your points are going to be within the debate, we rely on, well, I like to rely on a set of axioms and then kind of infer everything else back from them. They're the things that are taken to be a given within the debate, and then from there I can sort of build upwards and make my case, or the other way of looking at it is you could make a series of statements which imply one from each other, and then when you get to the point where you have a true thing, you can say, well, because this implies the true thing, like logically all of the other things sort of follow on from it. So do you think that the phrase gambling is addictive is a true statement that you could use for an axiom?
Yeah. No,
Yes?
no.
Who said yes? Okay. Okay. Put your hand up if you think that it's a true statement. Put your hand up if you don't think it's a true statement. Okay, why isn't it a true statement?
It's not always.
Why isn't it always?
In some, well, I'm not familiar with precise.
You don't have to do the science.
Gambling, but plausibly, a thing that I could claim in a debate is that some people don't have the addictive personality necessary for it to become addictive. I don't know if that's a true claim about the world, but that is plausible.
I have gambled before. I am not addicted to gambling, therefore the statement like gambling is addictive for all people is false. Right, so you can't make that claim. You could make the claim that some people are addicted to gambling, but you could not make the claim that gambling is addictive, just that pure statement by itself. So now we're going to play a game, and we're going to write the answers of the game on the board. It's just going to be fun because my handwriting is terrible. So who would like to volunteer something that they consider to be an axiom that they would take as true within a debate? Some of you must have won debates before. At some point. Adam.
Yeah. Do you want to ask me a question again?
It's alright, you've been rescued. Yep.
Homophobia is bad.
Homophobia is bad.
I'm really hoping that I'm going to say that one is not true.
Okay, give me another one. Statement that you believe to be true. Adam?
States shouldn't allow people to starve to death.
Okay.
No one knows.
This is a really good pen. This is neat as my handwriting. Yep.
Involuntary pain is bad.
Involuntary pain is bad. Any others? Bender?
The consequences of an action to some extent determine its morality.
Why?
What?
Lack of memory.
To some extent.
Yeah, no, I'm leaving that bit out. Anyone else?
No, I said morality, not reality.
Sorry, morality.
Like,
That was just my handwriting. It's just how I spell morality. It's fine. Any others? Anyone new? You all have to offer one before I let you leave this room. Yeah.
Happiness is intrinsically good.
Happiness is good.
Yeah.
Okay. Any others?
Access to healthcare is good.
Access to healthcare is good. Any others? Yep.
Innocent civilians dying in wars is a bad thing.
Innocent civilians dying in wars is a bad thing.
what if they want to vote?
Can we just leave?
Any others? Yep.
Resources shouldn't be squandered.
Resources should be squandered. Okay, any more? Yep.
Having surplus money allows you to buy things.
That's all you see.
So true.
I understand the game.
Yes, you do. You do understand the game. Yep.
You should not act immoral.
Okay.
Is there a rule that just everything loosely says goes
Yes, that is the rule of life.
Any others? Yes. Logic is absolute and universal.
No. No.
Any others? Sort of dwindling now. Take one more and then. Right. Okay, so by a show of hands, who thinks that this side of the board is the axioms and the true things, and who thinks this side of the board is the axioms and the true things? So votes for the things over here.
Is that true?
These are the true. If you think these are the true things. Adam, do you know which side of the board I'm pointing at the moment? No, you didn't. Okay. Hands up if you think these are the true things. So who thinks that you could use these to be axioms in a debate, and who thinks that you can use these things? Any votes for this side? Okay, so for all the people who didn't put their hand up, which board are you voting for? Is it this one?
Yes.
You vote, okay, who thinks that these are all the axioms and true things? Okay. So, in my personal opinion, which is not the correct answer in all cases, but I can make a pretty good case for my personal opinion, and I will judge most of you tomorrow. You could use these things as axioms, which are true within your debate. I could dispute all of these things and disprove them to be true within a debate if I came up against you, and so you probably shouldn't rely on them to be absolute axioms. Yes?
So, say if you have a lot of surplus of money, so what happens if you say Germany after Second World War, your money is so devalued that millions of currency doesn't.
So there's a difference between having like surplus money in terms of like absolute money, and then there's a difference in terms of having like a big number of money because of things like exchange rates. So I presumed here that the surplus of money was like the actual money as
What about
opposed to just a
Venezuela?
big
There's no
number.
supply.
As opposed to what?
Like if you're in Venezuela, there's no supply of that good.
I assume that's an individual act.
And
I thought that there was only the surplus money next to
So I think in Venezuela they do have stuff. I mean, this is not that specific. Potentially, having money doesn't allow me to buy whatever I want because of things like laws and supply, but it definitely does allow me to buy things if things do exist.
What if you're in prison?
You're allowed to buy things in prison.
But you can't use one.
Yeah,
What if you're in a prison which doesn't allow you to buy things?
Yes.
How would you argue against the claim happiness is good without using exterior arguments that couldn't be equally applied to a statement such as homophobia is bad?
Because I don't want the people that I think are awful to be happy.
Yeah.
And there are specific debates where the opposition is that argument. Yeah.
Can I just ask, what do you mean by you should not act immorally? Because I mean, I can see on a certain interpretation that might be something that you can contest, but on an equally valid interpretation, doesn't that just read, you should not act in ways that you should not act?
So the statement you should not act immorally, I presume to mean like you should not do a bad thing, but sometimes doing a bad thing is the thing that I want to do, and sometimes doing a bad thing is the only option that I have. And sometimes doing a bad thing from certain perspectives doesn't actually look like a bad thing. So there are lots of immoral.
That's not necessarily immoral, like I can smoke it.
Well, so that's the debate. So there are some things which, like, so we agree homophobia is bad. Can you let me finish the sentences? So we can argue. So homophobia is definitely bad. Doing that, saying something homophobic, definitely bad. Potentially, a person might want to say a homophobic thing to impress a group of people who think that homophobia is actually funny. So they are doing a bad thing, but that would be a reason for them to do a bad thing. And potentially there would be positive consequences from joining that group of people, which would eventually overwrite the fact that they did a bad thing by being homophobic, but in that specific time, they did an immoral thing. So there are lots of cases where you can make an argument for why you should act immorally. Nonetheless, because morally, morality is quite subjective, so that kind of helps. Yes?
But if you can always argue that certain people should not have good things, like they shouldn't have happiness, can you also say that these people, they should have a fear of homophobia, they should have a fear of this and that? Not the acts, but the actual fear. Like if you can argue, there are certain people in society who shouldn't be happy, can you as equally argue, there are certain people in society that should feel this fear or should feel these bad things?
No, because they're slightly different. So homophobia is definitely bad. Potentially from the fact that if you're making a debate about how some people do not deserve happiness, then you could argue, sort of by an extension of that, they should experience homophobia, which is experiencing a bad thing, so they're not contradictory. But this is like a debate, much of which will occur tomorrow. So that's not really what I want to get to. But do we all agree that there are things that you could say to each of these statements which you could use to disprove any of these statements? So the things that I consider to be axioms are like actual facts. So pi is an irrational number. Feel free to use that as an axiom in any of your debates, potentially to earn extra skill points. But also things that are not disputed in a debate, right? So if in opening government you set up your case as we think that it is immoral to squander resources, and no one in opposition disputes that fact. If you say, we think resources should never be squandered, and from that point we're going to make all of our arguments, and no one in opposition actually says, well, here are some reasons why potentially it's okay to squander resources, then that stands as an axiom within the debate. Because you don't have to defend it if they don't dispute it. So axioms are true things, and they are things that are not disputed within the debate. And it's really great if you have a lazy opposition who doesn't question your axioms. You should capitalise that and infer things from them. See what statements they're willing to buy and which statements they are. And then not axioms are everything else. And they are all the things that you have to defend within a debate. So in a lot of debates, people will say, oh, we should do this thing because democracy is inherently good. But it isn't. It doesn't always work. It's not always a great thing. So anything that you say, from the point where you say, democracy is inherently good, if I am your judge and I don't find that to be intuitively true, then I don't find the rest of your arguments persuasive. So for all statements that are even the tiniest bit subjective, which are these ones and most of the things that we say in debates, it is always important to give a reason for why you have set up that as your case. So when you do the framing that Adam talked about, explaining why you have chosen that framing, why the set of axioms that you are talking about within the debate can be perceived to be absolute and true, why opposition has to accept what you're talking about to be like the frame that we're looking through this debate in, is really important. Because your judges don't have the same perspective on the world as you. So there was, in the last talk, the thing about conservatism and whether or not that's right. So you may think that people should have to work for their benefits, and I may think that they deserve it because they were born in this state and this state provides benefits. And that's maybe my personal philosophy and you have a different one. So if you made an argument based on the fact that people should have to work for their benefits, then I'm not going to find that as intuitive, I'm not going to find that as persuasive as you would if you were sat judging your speech. So anything that you have, which is just a little bit subjective, it is always worth explaining to the judge why you have decided to make that statement within the debate and give some plausible reasons for why it's true. And a lot of people don't do this. So even though it can be quite difficult, it can be quite difficult, sort of particularly the first time you try and make these arguments, to explain sort of precisely or succinctly why something like democracy is inherently a good thing. To fit that into maybe two pieces of analysis so that it doesn't take up all the time in your speech, which you need to be arguing about why you're actually going to be providing democracy and why this is going to improve the lives of people, and the things that most debates sort of spend most of their time on. You actually don't have to say very much, because the other side probably isn't going to say anything at all, because this is the kind of analysis which people don't think that they have to do, when actually they do have to do it. It's the kind of analysis that people forget to do, or just don't do, because it seems actually quite difficult to articulate these kind of ideas. It seems kind of difficult to articulate why actually killing innocent civilians in war is a bad thing. If you haven't really heard anyone do analysis about how people are not means to an end, why all of those individual lives cannot be weighed up against other people's individual lives because they represent an infinite amount of possibilities. That person never chose to be there, they probably didn't consent to that war, why their life is as equal as all of the destruction that is happening around them, and why they should be protected, even if it means that the war will last longer. That kind of analysis is not something that people generally chat about in the pub. But if you started doing that, then you would become more comfortable making that analysis, and you can fit it into two little additional lines that you can fit into your speech. It makes your speech a lot denser, and it makes your speech an awful lot more persuasive. But it is most important when it comes for judges comparing what you have said to what other teams have said. Because a lot of the time, what we have to do is compare two assertions, which is really difficult. It doesn't work out for you guys because most of those assertions are judged based on the subjective biases of the judge themselves. But also it's a pain in the ass for us because often people will do the exact amount of work and will have two equally well analysed arguments that just are opposites of each other, and no one has told us which one is more important, no one has made us believe, or even put any effort into making us believe which one of those things is more true. And then we have to work out which one we think is more persuasive, and then we'll give it to the team that asserted theirs first, or the team that did a little bit of rebuttal to the other team. And then when you try and explain that back to teams, they're like, oh, but we said all these things and they seemed really persuasive. We don't understand why we took a third, we needed a second in order to break. And the judge was like, we didn't prove any of the things that you said. So if you want to stop that happening, and I definitely would like to stop that happening, you have to, any question which is, any statement which is subjective, do that little extra bit of analysis to try and show people why plausibly it could be true. And all you have to do is show why it's plausible. You don't have to prove it absolutely. You just have to make the judge think that they could believe in the statement that you're saying. Does that make sense? Which I think is a much smaller burden than absolutely proving a thing to be true, because outside of mathematics, nothing really is. In terms of re-characterising and the framing things that we heard about in the last talk, a lot of extension speakers will stand up and say, so this debate actually is not about the things that people in top half have talked about, so I'm going to re-characterise the debate now. We're going to look at the debate from this specific angle. Often, the top half teams might not have explicitly characterised the debate or framed the debate, but they will have basically done it with the arguments that they've made. If you want your re-characterisation to be more important to supersede what they have said, either you have to be significantly better and more persuasive than they are, which, given power pairing in debates, competitions often isn't the case, or you have to explain why your framing is better than theirs. One of the most difficult clashes to adjudicate is like opening government versus closing opposition, or opening opposition versus closing government, because only one of those teams is able to respond to the other team. And when one team stands up and re-characterises the debate and then starts having a different debate to the one that we've just heard in the top half, if all they've done is asserted that their characterisation is correct, and the top half team has also created some kind of framing for the debate, then you don't just win because you spoke later. You don't just seem more favourable in the judge's eyes because you spoke after they did, or even because you were just that tiny bit clearer. You still have a burden to prove that your re-characterisation is better than the one that we heard. Why is it more plausible that we should be looking at your speech from your perspective, as opposed to looking at your speech from the perspective that we heard from top half, which unfortunately means that your speech is entirely irrelevant and basically rubbish, which gives you the fourth. And that's the difference between like being like winning the debate and actually being entirely irrelevant because of what's been set out by top half. So when you are going to characterise a debate, the first thing you have to, well, actually you probably want to do it second. The second thing you want to do is disprove the characterisation or disprove the statements that we heard from top half. Even when they make very plausible sounding statements like these, they can be disproven because they are subjective. If you are going to assert an opposite statement to what they have said, it is insufficient for you to give plausible reasons as to why I should believe yours. It's insufficient for you to like prove yours. You have to disprove what they've said. You have to give me some plausible reasons as to why, actually, I don't have to look at the debate in the same way that they want to look at the debate, or actually why the statements that they're saying don't necessarily have to be true. So, essentially, in order to sort of create a clear framework in which you win a debate, I think it's quite useful to look at it as a research question, where you're trying to show that if it's a this house would motion, the thing that you want to do is going to have a positive impact or is going to have a negative impact. And then you evaluate that based on a set of hypotheses which follow quite logically. They're everything which is necessary and sufficient in order to prove your research question. In order to prove those hypotheses, you either have to have a bunch of really true things, or you have to have a bunch of subjective things which you've done some work to show can be true things. You have to do more than what the other teams have said by doing more of that slightly plausible analysis, but more importantly, you have to show that the things that they are claiming to be true probably aren't, or at the very least don't have to be, and that's how you, within a debate, prove the things that you've said that you're going to prove. Does that make sense? 5 people, excellent, that was more than I was expecting. Okay, does anyone have any questions? Yes, very quick.
Why did you put logic is absolute or universal?
You said universal. If intelligent life exists elsewhere, we have no idea if they follow the same logic framework as we do.
Logic. So you need to establish logic. So if that was us, we began to
No, okay. So if you're going to make claims about universality, then you have to prove that all people, all other intelligent life forms, are going to have logic, which I don't think that they will. Yes.
How do we stop a debate ending up like this now?
This great thing called that stops people's speeches. Yes.
But I mean, not really when people just are arguing about stuff that seems really meta and not really relevant.
Okay, so what happened there was one person said logic is absolute, we need logic to understand logic, and then one person said no, actually there's a distinction between logic and saying persuasive things. What both of those people need to do is then exactly define what they mean by logic in this particular instance, and then show why the things, so the first person would need to show why the two statements that were made were absolutely the same, and the other person would have to say why they are different. And then they would have to do more work. Please don't interrupt, please put your hand up again. They would have to do more work than they did in that small discussion to prove either of those statements. If both of them fail to do that, then they're essentially doing the thing that I described at the beginning, which I don't think is very good debating, that a lot of people do before they start doing that sort of extra analysis. Probably be a wash. Hopefully their partners would say other things, probably judge their teams based on other arguments that they made within the debate, because that will probably be a draw. Yes?
So whilst the centreboard isn't by definition axioms, things like states shouldn't be allowed to let people starve will in 95% of debates carry, right? In most cases, unless you're talking about like a very specific case, like maybe a development economics motion, you can probably get away with stuff like that. What's a good way, because obviously we don't want to be analysing every one of those centre axioms when we don't need to. What's a good way of, I don't know, maybe even framing or doing something with the stuff on the centreboard to ensure that it won't be taken down?
So the state shouldn't allow starvation, specific example. Say you're OG, the PM is making an argument which depends on this statement to be true. They probably wouldn't want to phrase it as like that. They probably want to phrase it as, we think that states have a moral responsibility to ensure that people do not starve. This is because blah, blah, blah. Maybe spend about 10 seconds on it. If it's disputed by opposition, then the DPM spends a couple of minutes explaining why that's the case. So in prep time, when you have that statement, you reckon it's probably not going to be disputed, but you come up with the material to ensure that you can prove it regardless. You then condense that down to the point where it doesn't really affect the PM speech, that they have to say it, spend about 5-10 seconds like adding a small amount to that argument at the very beginning of their argument. In their case, best case scenario, no one disputes it, PM probably gets a couple of extra, or maybe an extra speak point, because if they do that with all of their points, their speech is a lot more dense, a lot more analysis, a lot more persuasive. Worst case scenario, opposition is like, aha, these are the examples where we would allow states to starve citizens, in which case the DPM can stand up and make the arguments that you discussed in prep time, which is going to defeat like flimsy responses from opposition saying why they couldn't do that. If opposition has a sufficient amount of material, because they've really thought about it and they've developed a really good case as to why states should be allowed to allow people to starve and you can't respond to it, it's not because you didn't do this or that you're a bad debater, it's just that they were slightly better than you. Does that answer your question? So if it's a little bit subjective, you probably want to come up with material anyway, you don't necessarily have to use that material. I definitely wouldn't spend 3 minutes of your PM's 5-minute speech explaining why states shouldn't allow to starve, because you're right, opposition will be like, probably concede that point, and then move on, which would be a waste of time. But that's the great thing about having 2 people within a team. Any other questions? No? Okay.